April 12th, 1945. Spring sunlight streams through the windows of the little white house in Warm Springs, Georgia. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sits in his leather armchair, gray suit draped across his shoulders, posing for a portrait. The war in Europe is nearly finished. American and Soviet armies are converging on Berlin. In the Pacific, Marines are bleeding through Okinawa, the final obstacle before Japan itself. After 3 years and 4 months of global warfare, after innumerable strategic choices made from this wheelchair, after forging the alliance that shattered fascism's spine, Roosevelt is 63 years old and exhausted beyond comprehension. A recording that the president seemed to maintain only a tenuous grasp on life. But on this mild Georgia afternoon, Roosevelt appears in decent spirits, signing documents, conversing, planning his attendance at the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco later that month. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Roosevelt raises his left hand to his temple. "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," he says softly. Then he collapses forward in his chair, unconscious. Within minutes, physicians arrive. Within 2 hours, despite every intervention they attempt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is dead. A massive cerebral hemorrhage killed him instantly. His heart finally surrendering after years of strain, after bearing the weight of a nation through depression and war, after more than 12 years in the world's most demanding office. The news races across the telegraph wires. In Washington, Vice President Harry Truman is summoned to the White House, where Eleanor Roosevelt informs him simply, "Harry, the president is dead." In the Pacific, soldiers and sailors weep openly upon hearing the news. In European cities being freed from Nazi occupation, people who'd never encountered Roosevelt mourn him as though they'd lost family. And in London, as evening descends and spring darkness gathers over a city still scarred by 5 years of war, a telephone rings in 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill is working in his study when he receives the call. He is 70 years old, Prime Minister for the second time in his life, having guided Britain through the desperate days of 1940, when they stood alone against Hitler. He is exhausted too, though he'd never acknowledge it, sustained by cigars and brandy and an iron will that refuses to yield. When his private secretary enters with the news, Churchill's expression becomes rigid. He says nothing for several seconds. Then he stands, walks to the window, and gazes out at the darkened streets of London. Those present that evening report that Churchill wept. This was not a man prone to public emotional displays. He'd maintained his composure through France's fall, through the Blitz, through years of defeats before the tide finally shifted. But now, with victory in Europe perhaps 3 weeks distant, with the grand alliance he and Roosevelt had constructed on the verge of its greatest triumph, Churchill breaks down. He covers his face with his hands. His shoulders shake. When he finally speaks, his voice is thick with grief. "I felt as if I had been struck a physical blow," he would later write. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt had been the axis around which the Allied war effort rotated. They'd first met briefly in 1918 at a London dinner when Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy and Churchill was Minister of Munitions. Roosevelt, young and ambitious, had been impressed by Churchill's energy but found him somewhat overbearing. Churchill, consumed with winning the First World War, barely registered the encounter. It would be more than 20 years before they spoke again. But when war arrived in Europe in September 1939, everything transformed. On the very day Britain declared war on Germany, Roosevelt sent a telegram to Churchill, who'd just been appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. "It is because you and I occupied similar positions in the World War that I want you to know how glad I am that you are back again in the Admiralty," Roosevelt wrote. He signed it, "Yours very sincerely." Churchill responded immediately, and thus began a correspondence that would eventually encompass more than 1,700 messages, a constant stream of telegrams and letters discussing strategy, resources, politics, and the world's future. In those early messages, they were measuring each other. Roosevelt was constrained by American neutrality laws and a public that wanted no involvement in another European war. Churchill was desperate for American assistance. Britain was fighting alone, its cities under bombardment, its survival genuinely uncertain. Churchill's messages were often lengthy, detailed, urgent. Roosevelt's were shorter, more cautious, but gradually more supportive. When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, Roosevelt sent congratulations. When France fell in June, Roosevelt promised aid. When the Blitz commenced in September, Roosevelt found methods to send destroyers and supplies despite the neutrality laws. They didn't meet face-to-face until August 1941, more than a year and a half after their correspondence began. Roosevelt, still officially neutral but increasingly committed to Britain's survival, arranged a secret meeting at sea. Churchill crossed the Atlantic on the battleship HMS Prince of Wales, arriving at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland on August 9th. Roosevelt came on the USS Augusta. For 4 days they talked. They attended church services together on the Prince of Wales's deck, British and American sailors singing identical hymns. They discussed strategy, resources, and what would become the Atlantic Charter, a statement of war aims including self-determination for all peoples and freedom from want and fear. Churchill was enchanted. He found Roosevelt charming, intelligent, deeply engaged with the war's details. Roosevelt was equally impressed by Churchill's determination and eloquence. They discovered they could collaborate, that they understood each other's constraints and possibilities. When they parted, Churchill felt for the first time since the war began that Britain would not fight alone. 4 months later, after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, that partnership became the foundation of Allied strategy. Over the next 3 years, they met 9 times. Roosevelt came to London. Churchill crossed the Atlantic repeatedly, spending Christmas 1941 at the White House, returning for extended visits in 1942 and 1943. They met in Casablanca in January 1943, where they announced the policy of unconditional surrender. They met in Quebec twice, August 1943 and September 1944, to plan operations and discuss the atomic bomb. They met in Cairo and Tehran in late 1943, bringing Stalin into their discussions for the first time. And they'd met just 2 months ago, in February 1945, at Yalta in the Crimea. That Yalta meeting had troubled Churchill profoundly, not because of what was decided, though the agreements on Poland and Eastern Europe would haunt him, but because of how Roosevelt appeared. The president was clearly failing. His hands trembled. He seemed to lose track of conversations. His attention drifted. Churchill, who prided himself on his stamina despite his own 70 years, was shocked by Roosevelt's decline. But Roosevelt had insisted he was fine, had made the brutal journey to the Crimea, had negotiated for 8 days with Churchill and Stalin. When they parted on February 11th, Churchill had wondered if he'd ever see Roosevelt again. Now, standing at the window of 10 Downing Street on the evening of April 12th, Churchill knows he won't. The partnership that had sustained him through the war, that had given him hope when Britain stood alone, that had mobilized the resources of history's greatest industrial power to defeat fascism, is over. And the war isn't quite finished. Germany is collapsing, but hasn't surrendered. Japan is still fighting. The Soviet Union, which had been a necessary ally against Hitler, is already showing signs of becoming the next great threat. Churchill had been planning to manage these challenges with Roosevelt beside him. Now he would face them with Harry Truman, a man he'd met exactly once, briefly, at Roosevelt's fourth inauguration in January. Churchill sits down at his desk and drafts a telegram to Eleanor Roosevelt. His hand is steady now, his emotions under control, but the words come slowly. I am deeply grieved to hear of the great loss that has befallen you and the American people, he writes. Please accept from me the expression of my most profound sympathy in your overwhelming sorrow. He pauses, thinking of everything he wants to say, everything Roosevelt had meant to him personally and to Britain. But this isn't the time for a lengthy tribute. Eleanor is a widow, her husband of 40 years suddenly gone. Churchill keeps it brief, formal, appropriate. He signs it and sends it immediately. Then he begins thinking about what to say publicly. As Prime Minister, he will need to address the House of Commons. The British people will need to hear from him. The world will be watching. But what could he say that would capture what Roosevelt had meant? How could he explain to people who hadn't been in those meetings, who hadn't exchanged those 1,700 messages, who hadn't built a strategy for defeating history's greatest tyranny, what had been lost? Over the next 5 days, as the world absorbs the shock of Roosevelt's death and Harry Truman is sworn in as president, Churchill works on his tribute. He consults his notes from their meetings. He rereads some of Roosevelt's messages. He thinks about their first encounter in 1918, which Roosevelt had apparently forgotten, but which Churchill now remembers with painful clarity. He thinks about their last meeting at Yalta, Roosevelt's exhaustion, his determination to see the war through. On April 17th, 5 days after Roosevelt's death, Churchill rises in the House of Commons to deliver his tribute. The chamber is packed. Members stand in silence as Churchill, dressed in his usual black coat and bow tie, walks to his place. He looks older than his 70 years, the weight of the war and now this loss visible in his face. My friendship with the great man to whose work and fame we pay our tribute today, Churchill begins, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, began and ripened during this war. I had met him, but only for a few minutes after the last war, and as soon as I went to the Admiralty in September 1939, he telegraphed inviting me to correspond with him direct on naval or other matters if at any time I felt inclined. He pauses, looking around the chamber. Having obtained the permission of the Prime Minister, I did so. Knowing President Roosevelt's keen interest in sea warfare, I furnished him with a stream of information about our naval affairs and about the various actions, including especially the action of the River Plate, which lighted the first gloomy winter of the war. Churchill's voice grows stronger as he continues. When I became Prime Minister, and the war broke out in all its hideous fury, when our own life and survival hung in the balance, I was already in a position to telegraph to the President on terms of an association which had become most intimate, and to me, most agreeable. This continued through all the ups and downs of the world's struggle until Thursday last, when I received my last messages from him. He describes their meetings, their shared determination, their growing friendship. I conceived an admiration for him as a statesman, a man of affairs, and a war leader, Churchill says. I felt the utmost confidence in his upright, inspiring character and outlook, and a personal regard, affection, I must say, for him beyond my power to express today. The house is absolutely silent. Many members are weeping openly. Churchill himself pauses several times, his voice breaking slightly before he regains control. In Franklin Roosevelt, there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, he continues, and the greatest champion of freedom who has ever brought help and comfort from the New World to the Old. He speaks for 20 minutes, describing Roosevelt's leadership, his vision, his determination to see democracy triumph over tyranny. He talks about the Atlantic Charter, about Roosevelt's commitment to the United Nations, about his belief in a world where people would be free from fear and want. He acknowledges Roosevelt's physical courage, how he'd overcome polio to lead a nation through depression and war, how he'd never let his disability limit his determination or his effectiveness. For us, it remains only to say that in Franklin Roosevelt, there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, and the greatest champion of freedom who has ever brought help and comfort from the New World to the Old, Churchill concludes, his voice now firm and clear. He will long be mourned by the British people and by free men and women in every land. The House rises in tribute, standing in silence for several minutes. Churchill returns to his seat, his face set, his emotions once again under control. But those close to him report that he remains deeply affected by Roosevelt's death for weeks afterward. He worries constantly about Truman, about whether the new president would maintain Roosevelt's commitment to the alliance, about whether he would understand the Soviet threat that Churchill can see emerging. He feels, in a very real sense, that he's lost not just a partner, but a friend. The irony is almost unbearable. Victory in Europe is now just 3 weeks away. On May 7th, Germany will surrender unconditionally. The war that Churchill and Roosevelt had fought together, the strategy they'd developed, the resources they'd mobilized, the alliance they'd built, all of it is about to achieve its ultimate triumph. But Roosevelt won't be there to see it. He died with the finish line in sight, having carried the burden almost to the end, but not quite reaching the moment when he could set it down. Churchill attends Roosevelt's funeral by proxy, sending Anthony Eden as his representative. He wants to go himself but can't spare the time. The war is still on, and there are urgent matters requiring his attention in London. But he sends a wreath with a simple card. From Winston Churchill, in sorrow and admiration. In the months that follow, as the war in Europe ends and the focus shifts to Japan and the emerging Cold War, Churchill often thinks about what Roosevelt would have done, what he would have said, how he would have handled Stalin's aggression in Eastern Europe. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Churchill sits across from Truman and Stalin negotiating the post-war settlement, and he feels Roosevelt's absence acutely. Truman is capable, decisive, but he isn't Roosevelt. He doesn't have the same relationship with Churchill, the same shared history, the same intuitive understanding. Years later, in his war memoirs, Churchill would write about Roosevelt with deep affection and respect. He would describe their partnership as one of history's great friendships, a relationship that had helped save civilization from barbarism. He would acknowledge their disagreements. There had been many, particularly over colonialism and the British Empire's future, but he would emphasize their shared commitment to freedom and democracy. I felt as if I'd been struck a physical blow, Churchill wrote of the moment he learned Roosevelt had died. My relations with this shining personality had played so large a part in the long, terrible years we had worked together. Now they had come to an end, and I was overpowered by a sense of deep and irreparable loss. That sense of loss never fully left him. In the years after the war, as Churchill watched the Cold War develop, as he gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, warning of Soviet expansion, as he returned to 10 Downing Street for a second term as Prime Minister from 1951 to 1955, he often wondered what Roosevelt would have made of it all. Would Roosevelt have seen the Soviet threat earlier? Would he have been more or less willing to confront Stalin? Would the post-war world have been different if Roosevelt had lived? These were unanswerable questions, but they haunted Churchill because what he'd said in the House of Commons that day in April 1945 was true. In Franklin Roosevelt, Britain had found its greatest American friend, and Churchill personally had found a partner whose loss left a void nothing could fill. The partnership between Churchill and Roosevelt had been built on more than just strategic necessity. Yes, they needed each other. Britain needed American resources. America needed Britain's experience and determination. But their relationship transcended mere calculation. They genuinely liked each other. They enjoyed their meetings, their long dinners discussing everything from naval strategy to the future of colonial empires to the best way to make a martini. They wrote to each other not just about military operations, but about books they were reading, speeches they were giving, their hopes for the world after the war. Roosevelt called Churchill Winston in their private correspondence, a familiarity that Churchill treasured. Churchill addressed Roosevelt as Mr. President in formal messages, but often began with "My dear Roosevelt," or even "My dear friend." They sent each other gifts. Churchill sent Roosevelt cigars. Roosevelt sent Churchill books and whiskey. They shared jokes, commiserated about difficult allies, and supported each other through the war's darkest moments. When Churchill stood in the House of Commons on April 17, 1945, delivering his tribute to Roosevelt, he was mourning not just a political partner, but a friend. The tears he'd shed 5 days earlier in his study at 10 Downing Street were genuine. The grief of a man who'd lost someone he'd come to depend on, someone who'd shared the burden of history's most consequential decisions, someone who'd understood what it meant to lead a nation through existential crisis. In Franklin Roosevelt, there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, Churchill had said. He meant it personally as much as nationally. Britain had lost a champion, but Churchill had lost a friend. And on that April evening in 1945, with victory so close but Roosevelt gone, Churchill felt the weight of that loss more heavily than almost any other burden the war had placed on him. The world would remember Roosevelt as the president who led America through depression and war, who created the New Deal, who mobilized the arsenal of democracy, who helped defeat fascism. Churchill would remember him as all of that and more, as the man who'd sent that first telegram in September 1939, beginning a conversation that would last nearly 6 years and 1,700 messages, as the man who'd met him at Placentia Bay and sung hymns on a battleship's deck, as the man who'd spent Christmas at the White House discussing strategy and the world's future, as the man who'd believed, as Churchill believed, that freedom and democracy were worth any sacrifice to preserve. When Churchill heard that Roosevelt had died, he wept. He wept for his friend. He wept for the partnership that had sustained him through the war's darkest days. And he wept, perhaps, for the future they would now have to build without Roosevelt's vision and determination to guide them. "I felt as if I had been struck a physical blow," Churchill wrote. In those simple words lay the full measure of what Roosevelt had meant to him and what his loss represented. Not just the death of a president, but the end of a friendship that had helped save the world. The bond between Churchill and Roosevelt was forged in crisis and strengthened through years of shared burden. From that first telegram in September 1939 to that final message on April 12, 1945, they had built something rare in international relations, a genuine friendship between two leaders who understood that they were fighting not just for their nations, but for civilization itself. Churchill had known other leaders, had worked with them, negotiated with them, even respected some of them. But Roosevelt was different. Roosevelt understood Churchill's Britain, isolated, battered, but unbowed. And Churchill understood Roosevelt's America, reluctant to enter the war, but, once committed, unstoppable in its determination. Together, they had turned that understanding into the most effective military alliance in history. They had coordinated strategy across two oceans, mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale, and held together a coalition that included everyone from Stalin's Soviet Union to de Gaulle's Free France. But beyond the strategy sessions and the diplomatic cables, beyond the conferences and the combined operations, there was something simpler and more profound. They had become friends. And when Roosevelt died, Churchill didn't just lose an ally. He lost the one person who truly understood what the past 5 years had cost him, what sacrifices Britain had made, what Churchill himself had endured. He lost the one person with whom he could share both the burden of leadership and the hope for victory. He lost the one person who could make him laugh even in the darkest moments, who could inspire him when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm, who could remind him why they were fighting. On April the 12th, 1945, when that telephone rang in 10 Downing Street and Churchill learned that Roosevelt was dead, he understood immediately that the war would end differently than he'd imagined. Victory would come. He never doubted that. But it would be incomplete somehow, hollowed out by Roosevelt's absence. The triumph they should have shared would belong only to the survivors. And Churchill, standing at that window looking out at London's darkened streets, wept not just for what had been lost, but for what would never be. The post-war world he and Roosevelt had dreamed of building together, the peace they had fought so hard to secure. In Franklin Roosevelt, there died the greatest American friend we have ever known, Churchill told the House of Commons. But to himself, in the privacy of his grief, he might have said something simpler and more painful: "I have lost my friend." That was what Churchill said when he learned Roosevelt had died. Not immediately. The tears came first, the physical shock, the overwhelming sense of loss. But when words finally came, they carried the weight of 5 years of shared struggle, of 1,700 messages exchanged, of 9 meetings held, of countless decisions made together. They carried the weight of a friendship that had helped save the world. And in that tribute Churchill delivered to the House of Commons, in those carefully chosen words that acknowledged both Roosevelt's greatness and Churchill's personal grief, there was a simple truth. Some losses are too great to measure, some friendships too valuable to replace, and some moments too painful to face without tears. Churchill had faced Hitler without flinching, but he could not face Roosevelt's death without weeping.